All right, welcome to the new section. This time we're talking all about JSX, which, depending on who you ask, stands for JavaScript Syntax Extension or JavaScript plus XML. It doesn't really matter which one it is. What does matter is that it's super useful and it makes our lives way easier. So just to jog your memory from like 5 minutes ago, JSX is the tool that allows us to type HTML-looking code directly in JavaScript, normally totally invalid as I showed you. So the point here is that basically it allows us to combine our UI with our JavaScript logic directly in our JavaScript file. So rather than having a separate template file in HTML that we then call upon in our JavaScript, we can look at a single component and directly see what it actually results in. Now behind the scenes, there's a ton of work which Babel is doing for us to actually convert those HTML characters into valid JavaScript code. And in the next video, I'll show you what that looks like under the hood. You can actually see the end result. One thing I want to mention, you do not have to use JSX. It's possible to write React code without JSX at all. It's just a lot uglier, and it's just a lot of extra function calls and much harder to understand at a glance. We'll learn more in the next video. So we've been over this. It's not legal JavaScript. It has to be transpiled to JavaScript, and you can do this using Babel, and that's why we have Babel included. So here are some of the basic rules we have to talk about. Either you write HTML or JSX tags that have an explicit opening and closing tag, or if you use a self-closing tag like an input, an image, and there's no inner HTML, there's only one tag, you have to have this slash. And we've already talked about this a bit when we were writing our first component. So I've made another copy of my index.html. I'm just going to call this, let's just do JSX demo file, and we'll be playing around in here. So I have an index.js as well. It's empty. So I'm going to define my component here called, I'm just going to call it demo, just like that. Or let's go with JSX demo. Okay. And it extends react.component, just like that. Okay. And then we have our render method. We need that. And we're going to return something. So we already talked about how we can only return one element. So if we have multiple tags in here, like if we were trying to do what we already saw, an H1 with another H1, so we have our first H1, and if I wanted a second one, that's invalid. We need to wrap it in a div or something else. But what I want to show you here is that we can also do things, for example, like an image. So if we do an image, we need to make sure to give it a source. So we'll come back with that. And we need to close it explicitly with that slash. I just found some image from unsplash.com, put it in here. We make sure we have that slash. Now, if we wanted to check this out, we just need to do our react dom.render, and dom needs to be capitalized. And the name of our component is now JSX demo. And we need a slash again, just like we did with our self-closing element here. And then we need to tell it where, just like before, document.getElementById. And the ID we give it is root, assuming that we still have a root here, which we do. Okay, so we're going to open up live server, and there we go. This massive image is displaying. Now remember, if I want to put an H1 in here or some title text that says my image, something like this, that causes an error. Our whole page goes away. We don't see anything rendered anymore. And that's because we're breaking a rule. We're not allowed to return multiple elements. We can't have these siblings. We can return one element. So once again, we wrap things in a div. And this is pretty standard, or perhaps something more semantic like a section tag or a nav tag, depending on what we're doing. So now we save, everything's back to normal, and we have our H1 and our image. Okay. So just to reiterate, we need opening, closing tags, unless we have a self-closing tag like an image where we have to have that slash. If we get rid of that, JSX is very unhappy. Okay. And then the other thing we talked about is we return a single element. So often we wrap multiple pieces with a div. So there's a ton more to JSX we're going to dive into, how we embed variables in here and JavaScript expressions, how we do dynamic styling, some forbidden words, some alternate syntax. But first, we're going to see in the next video what this actually generates for us. This is just an illusion. It looks like HTML, but it's creating JavaScript underneath. So let's take a look. All right, in this video, we're going to see what the magic of JSX is actually doing. So we write these HTML looking tags, but Babel is doing a whole bunch of magic to convert them to JavaScript function calls. And if we look at the docs for React, if you click on JSX in depth, it says, fundamentally, JSX just provides syntactic sugar, a nice little wrapper, for react.createElement. So when you create a button, for example, or in this case, a component called myButton, it's actually generating react.createElement and then a bunch of arguments that are passed in. So we can see this happen live. If we go to babeljs.io, this is the homepage for Babel, which we're using in our very simple React app. You can go to try it out. And on the left-hand side, you'll see there's a couple of options. The one we want to check is React. So this is, it's called a preset here, and it will allow us to type React code over here, JSX, and spit out the corresponding function calls or method calls. So if we try something really simple, like we just make an H1, or not a hi, an H1, like this, and then we make sure to add in some sort of text like hi. You can see react.createElement, H1, and then null, and then hi. So we'll talk more about these actual arguments, but you can see the first one is the type of element, the type of HTML tag or element. This one we'll come back to. And then this one is the inner text that we added in, hi. But let's try something more complicated. Let me make this a bit larger too. What if we take this example? We have a div with an H1 with an image inside of it, and that image has a source. So let's paste that. Okay, well, that's quite ugly formatting. Sorry about that. But if we ignore that part, notice what we get over here. We get a couple of create elements and they're nested. So we have react.createElement with a div in it. And then inside of that div, we have another react.createElement with an H1. And then the text of that is my image. And then another argument, yet again, react.createElement image. And then we're passing in a source set to this URL. So this is still only, 3 elements? When we have super long forms, for example, we're getting a ton of react.createElements, but we don't have to type any of it. We just type this easy to understand syntax. So one further example, let's start again with something super trivial. Let's do an H3 tag. And in this one, we'll say, I am an H3. Okay, close it. And what do we get? We get this. We can copy this. And instead of returning all of this, we could return that. And if we save and we go and look at our browser, we have the exact same thing that we got when we were using just a regular H3 tag inside of this render method. So instead of writing all of this, which you totally could do, and this is for a single element, but remember what it looked like with 10 elements, or imagine what it would look like. We don't have to do any of that. We just write our HTML looking code. This is not HTML, so there are some additional rules we have to talk about. We've already discussed things like you have to have a closing tag, you have to have the slash on a self-closing tag. There are a couple of other distinctions we need to go over. What I'm going to talk about in the next video is one of the more powerful tools, which allows us to actually embed JavaScript expressions into our JSX, so we can create dynamic content. So that's next. In this video, we're going to learn more about JSX, in particular, how we can embed JavaScript expressions directly inside of our HTML-looking tags. So let's say I have the same JSX demo component. It's rendering over here. I have the server going. Let's say that I add in an H1. Okay, simple, boring. What I can do is something like, let's say my number is, and then curly braces. Inside of these curly braces, I can write JavaScript, like 2 times 8.4, something like that, and save. So this is not going to show up as 2 times 8.4. It's going to show up as the answer, the computed code. So this escapes JSX and says, okay, this is regular JavaScript right here. So let's take a look. There we go. My number is 16.8. Great number. So that's something really simple, and you probably would never do that because it's exactly the same every time we run this. But what we will do is have a bunch of components where they have different properties, different numbers and inputs and data sets, and we need to utilize them to change the actual output, to change the content that we see. So again, using those braces, we can embed JavaScript. And it's not just when we're working inside of HTML elements like this. We'll see that we can do dynamic styles in CSS. You'll see that we can pass properties dynamically. We can pass objects around. There's a whole bunch of things we can do. But for now, let's say that I want to make a function. And this function is going to give me a new mood. So this will be like a mood ring. We'll say my current mood is, and then in here, we're going to call a function which should return a mood, like angry or happy, or I don't know, depressed. That's probably most likely. I'm just kidding. Okay, I'm not trying to make light of depression, okay? So we'll call a function that doesn't exist, like get mood. And we want those parens there. If we just do this, it's just referencing a function. So we want to execute it. Of course, if I save it right now, nothing shows up because there is no function, get mood. So let's define that. And for now, we'll just do it up top. We'll talk more about where we would actually define a function like this. So let's make a array called moods, and we're going to pick from it at random. So let's say the first one is angry. The second one is hungry, and I'll fast forward. Okay, so I have this array, and then what I'm going to do is randomly pick one element. There's a lot of ways of doing this, but here's how I'm going to do it. What I'm doing is taking the moods array, and I am taking the length of it, finding a random number, multiplying it by the length, and then flooring it. And this is just a pretty standard way of grabbing something from an array at random. You could also use a library or make a method to do this. That's not the point here. So I'm getting a random string, and then I am calling it right here, get mood. Let's test it out. My mood is hungry. Refresh. Now I'm paranoid. Hope someone's after me. I refresh again. Now I'm just so angry. One more time. Oh, back to paranoid.
And now I'm silly.
Okay, so that's a simple example, but we can embed JavaScript using these braces inside of JSX. We'll do it all the time. Like pretty much every component we write from here on out, we'll be using these curly braces. We can do loops, which we have yet to discuss. We can embed conditional logic. So we display one thing given a condition, and if not, we display something else. There's a lot of things we can do. But this is just a little taste.